David Shoemaker. I'm the master of 14 Lodge, Ordo Templi Orientis. We are the local representative of Ordo Templi Orientis worldwide. We have been here in the Sacramento area of Oroville for almost 40 years. We were founded in October of 1979, so we're going to be celebrating our 40th anniversary next year. How many people have been watching the Strange Angels show? Okay. How many people are confused by the Strange Angels show? The mysterious goings on at Agape Lodge, which they mispronounce it. So, our mission today is going to be to talk to you about the real story behind Jack Parsons and his life, what he did in rocketry, what he did in magic, and give you some behind-the-scenes information about not just him, but the other characters who surround him in the show, they've changed a lot of the names for some reason, I don't know why, but they are based mostly on real people that we know a lot about. And in some cases, they're based on people that either we knew personally or people we knew personally knew them. So we've got some interesting ways of bringing the story behind Strange Angel to life for you today, I think. Now, especially if you're watching the show, or if you think in the future you might watch the show, I'm presenting the actual history of Jack Parsons, so there's going to be spoilers, right? There's no way I can avoid telling you what happens. So if you want to run from the room now to avoid any spoilers, I understand. I won't take it personally. What I've got here to start with is a series of historical slides. I'm going to kind of walk you through, basically chronologically, Jack Parsons' story, trying to weave together both the career in rocketry and solid rocket propulsion that was his specialty, and show how that weaves together with his work in magic, with the OTO and otherwise. And the book that the show is based on was also my main reference point for some of the historical details, and it's Strange Angel by George Pendle. He's about 10 years old now. Strange Angel was a painting that Marjorie did of Jack Parsons, and you'll get to see that later on in the slide. And it is a strange painting for sure. But Jack was a strange guy. So. All right. So, let's get started. That's Jack Parsons. Does it look like he's doing something important with that wire? I think he thinks he's doing something very important with that wire. Jack's family was very wealthy. This was his mother's family primarily, the Whitesides. And he was raised in a pretty sheltered environment among moneyed people in the Los Angeles area. Ended up mostly in the Pasadena area that was at that time getting really popular as a place for the rich people to go and live and build big houses on lots of land that had previously been orange groves and such. So there was a kind of a millionaire's row, and this area of town in particular was the home to people like Mr. Bush from the Anheuser-Busch beer family and folks like that, a lot of tycoons of various industries. And so this is where his home base was growing up. He went to good schools. He was doted on by his grandfather, who was the rich person in the family, raised by his grandfather and his mother. His father was largely absent, as you see kind of emphasized in the show. He had an early interest in science fiction. He liked to read science fiction comic books. He, because of this interest in science and science fiction, he was teased in school. He was not one of the popular kids, not so much into sports, more into reading, just a little nerdy, and that wasn't cool then. Got kind of pudgy and just wasn't one of the cool kids. Eventually he goes to military academy and gets expelled. One of his best friends was Ed Foreman. And Ed Foreman is the real life person who his buddy in the show is based on, who is his friend in the rocketry team that he's working with. I forget the character's name on the show. Anybody remember?
It's Richard.
Richard. Thank you. So they start experimenting with rocketry like most young boys, as I recall. We like to go out into the world and set things on fire and blow things up. And so did Jack Parsons and Ed Foreman. They would go out and experiment with explosives and see what they could do. Interestingly, in his very early adulthood, Jack Parsons started corresponding with Werner von Braun, who is, of course, the German rocketry engineer who eventually, helped the Nazis with their program. But von Braun was about Parsons' age, and they had this fairly extensive correspondence for a while. So he managed to get in touch with important people right from the outset. Now, 1929, what do you think happened? The stock market crash. Jack's grandfather loses the family fortune. Their lifestyle had to be constrained. And it was this experience, this sort of constriction of the ease of circumstances that he had, that really trained in him a lot of the self-reliance that carried him through the rest of his life. He realized he was not going to be pampered anymore. He was going to have to figure out how to make it on his own in the world. So he got a job with Hercules Powder Company, and that is Hercules as in the town that's in Northern California here that you drive past on the way over to sort of that Pinole area, I guess. And he worked there in what sounds like pretty miserable circumstances, getting horribly corrosive and explosive stuff all over his clothes and his body every day, getting dirty. And he said in a comment on what those days were like for him, that it was mostly fine and nobody really generally got hurt unless they didn't realize that they had some chemicals under their fingernails and then went home and lit a match and blew their fingers off. So don't do that. But it was a good education, definitely on the job, in explosives and propellants. He was working with all kinds of stuff like that, which fascinated him. He started to go to Stanford, but that was way too expensive for what he was earning at the Hercules Powder Company. Unsurprisingly, he returned to Pasadena, to where his family still was, and soon after, with then Helen Northrup. They were married in April of 1935, when he was 20 and she was 24. And he supported them by working at the Halifax Powder Company, which is another explosives manufacturing company, but in Southern California. So, Helen, of course, they've changed the name on the show to Susan. I can't figure out why they would change these historical names, but it's not like these folks are around and alive to object anymore. But in any case, that's another picture of Helen. Around this time, they began, it was maybe late 30s, 39-ish, they began attending Agape Lodge, which is the Hollywood-based outpost of OTO. OTO, as we'll find out, is an international mystical fraternal organization that was at the time run by Aleister Crowley, who you may have heard of. And we'll talk more about who he is and what the OTO is later. That's one of the things I really want to do today, is help you get to understand what this is really about, as opposed to the way it's kind of depicted on the show. So they started attending the Gnostic Mass. This is the altar at Agape Lodge as it stood from 35 to 42 or so there in Hollywood. So when you see on the show them going to the lodge and something that they're depicting as the Gnostic Mass, which isn't quite, this is what it really looked like in that room at that time. One of the legacies of 418 Lodge is that our founding master, Phyllis Seckler, was living in this house and attended these masses and was friends with all the people on the show and worked with them and did magic with them and witnessed these events. And she had lots of stories to tell. So as I can think of little tidbits you might want to know from her memory, I'll definitely share them with you. She was my personal teacher and my best friend right up until her death in 2004. And she was the master of this lodge from 1979 right up until her death. So this was what Jack and Helen encountered as they started attending Mass. Now, the atmosphere at Agape Lodge there was, I think, pretty close to what's depicted on the show, in the sense that you had a bunch of kind of left of center, creative, benignly weird types of people hanging out there. And it was a place of much social tolerance. You see in the show that there's one of the main characters, Ernest, is apparently gay or bisexual, and you see him going to bars and getting harassed by the police and such. That was going on a lot in LA at the time. So 14 Lodge, Agape Lodge was a place where that wasn't going to happen. You could come and be yourself and be weird and dress up and run around naked or whatever you wanted to do. That's not Thelema per se. That's what they did in that house. But the point being, this was a weird and fun place to hang out. So to the extent that that's what happens in the show, that's accurate. The group there was being publicly run as the Church of Thelema. Thelema is the term that Aleister Crowley chose to represent his religious and philosophical tradition. And the word means will. We'll talk more about that later, but if you hear the word Thelema, it's the tradition of Aleister Crowley, the tradition of OTO, and that's what that's all about. So let's meet some of these people in real life. On the show, he is referred to as what, the Grand Magus? But in reality, this was Wilfred Smith. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think the casting was pretty good on the show in terms of kind of nailing these main characters. Wilfred Smith is British. He was the head of OTO in the US at the time, and therefore definitely of the lodge there in Hollywood. We'll learn a lot more about his ups and downs later on, but there's your Grand Magus. Crowley said he never quite figured out how to wear robes well, but I think he looks okay now. As we'll see, Crowley liked to pick on Smith quite a bit. Another person living there at Agape Lodge was Jane Wolfe. Jane Wolfe was a silent film star in Hollywood, much earlier in her life. But in 1920, she hooked up with Crowley and moved to Cefalù, Sicily, where he had the Abbey of Thelema. This was sort of a communal living arrangement that he was experimenting with, all done in accordance with the laws of Thelema. So Jane was one of, probably the person who lived there longer than anyone else, really from 1920 to 1923. She was even there after Crowley left. So this is Jane meditating there on the beach. She's going to be an important figure for a number of reasons, but one of the most important is that there at Agape Lodge in Hollywood in the late 30s and 40s and into the 50s, she was the only person on site who had actually studied with Crowley. So far she hasn't been depicted in the show, but Jane Wolfe was the person there who was really Crowley's eyes and ears about what was going on in the area, but also in the whole country with regard to Thelema. She became Phyllis Seckler's teacher, who again was our founding lodge master. So one of the cool things about 418 Lodge, if I may brag on us again, no doing it my own, but we are the only existing local body in the OTO that was founded by someone with a link to the original Agape Lodge in the 1930s and 40s. So we're the only group with continuity back to that time that is still in existence. And I think that's pretty cool. There's Phyllis in early life. She was an artist and was attending college in LA. She found the lodge by going to drama classes, and her drama teacher was Regina Call, who is the woman who is mostly serving as priestess in the Gnostic Mass at Agape Lodge at the time. There's Crowley when he was at Cambridge. Doesn't look too sinister, right? Aleister Crowley was from a prosperous beer brewing family. He got a sizable inheritance from that business, and was always interested in mystical and magical things, and got his training in the organization known as the Golden Dawn, which was a prominent magical organization in the late 1800s in England. And here's him in his magician's garb, also around 1907, 08, 09, in those years. So you'll see characteristic implements of a magician, like the crown, the robe, the wand in his hand. There's a bell draped over what's known as the stele of revealing. It's like an Egyptian funeral stele. A sword, vial of oil, the Book of the Law, which is the foundational religious text of Thelema. This was my first copy ever. I put it in my laptop bag all the time. 25 years. So there's Crowley, all geeked out as a magician. So, meanwhile, Jack and Helen are attending all these fun and crazy parties and learning about Thelema, being alternately fascinated and intimidated by what they're encountering there. In the meantime, Jack is continuing his rocketry work with the so-called Suicide Squad. That's the name that they actually gave them in real life, not just on the show. Presumably because they were destined to blow themselves up at any moment with their explosives. They were working at Caltech, as depicted on the show, experimenting with all kinds of new technologies of rocket propulsion. We'll learn a little bit more about what specific discoveries Jack found that became so important in terms of rocketry. In February of 1941, Jack and Helen were initiated into OTO. The first degree is called Minerval, and they both took that degree on February 15th of that year. Smith, back in the turban, wrote to Crowley with some hopefulness about Jack. And then Jane Wolfe also wrote to Carl Germer, who was the OTO treasurer at the time, and eventually Crowley's successor. And she said about Jack, "This year there's more hope. We have an A1 man who's joined up. Crowley-esque in attainment, as a matter of fact." So there's Jane Wolfe as the only person who had actually worked with Crowley on site. And she's impressed by Jack, thinks he might be kind of cut from the same cloth as Crowley himself. So that's high praise. Jack begins inviting people to Agape Lodge. He's a really good outreach guy. He's got, presents himself as pretty professional, put together, and intelligent, and charming, so he's good at getting people interested in showing up at these events. Among the people invited was Grady McMurtry. Grady McMurtry was a soldier who later became the head of OTO. But also, Jack had been attending these science fiction writers' meetings So he was hobnobbing with people like Ray Bradbury and Robert Heinlein and all the early Southern California luminaries of science fiction. So this was a pretty intellectual and interesting crowd. And the overlap of people interested in magic and people interested in science and people interested in philosophy and poetry and art and music was a nice hotbed of interaction there at Agape Lodge. Pretty stimulating. When Phyllis talked about showing up at the lodge the first time, this is exactly what she said. She said, I hadn't been around people like this before. She was so excited about the atmosphere there. And frankly, that was my first experience of getting around Thelemites. You know how you go through life, and every once in a while, you meet one person who just seems like so totally themselves and just alive and doing their thing and just vibrant. And it might be weird, but it's great because it's them, you know, and you just know what they are. So when I walked into my first Thelema event, everybody in there was that person. And I still find that to be true. We seem to attract people who are alive in that way. And maybe something in our work helps people become that. I hope so. So in any case, this was a great place to be. A stimulating, interesting place to be, culturally, artistically. They had these big parties and big open houses. And this was one of them in 1937. This is the actual house where Agape Lodge met, so when they show that in the show, this is what's being depicted. This was Crowley night. Crowley never made it over, but they were celebrating Crowley here. Some interesting personages here in the photo. John Carradine, the actor, the father of Keith and David Carradine, from Kung Fu and Kill Bill and all that. He's the guy with the bow down crouching in front there. I don't know why he brought a bow to the party, but that's the kind of thing you can do at these parties, I guess. And Jane Wolfe is on his third from right, sort of peeking over the shoulders of people. Regina Call, I mentioned earlier, was the main priestess of the lodge, is, I had her, where she go? Yes. Standing up, if you look at the first row of people standing from the left, she's the sort of heavyset, short, black-haired woman there standing. And so this is the vibe of these parties, interesting collection of odds and ends of people. So Jack persuades Grady McMurtry to join OTO. He also persuades Helen, his wife Helen's younger sister, who is named Betty, or sometimes goes by Sarah, and she's depicted on the show. Persuades her to join OTO as well. This turns out to be really important for our little story. Jack starts teaching twice weekly discussion groups at his house, and this includes both OTO people and Caltech people, and membership starts to grow. He convinces his friend Ed Foreman and his wife to join OTO. So again, the guy on the show is Richard on the show, ends up joining. Here's some of the folks at the lodge at the time. Jane Wolfe's on the left there. I've never been able to figure out who this next person is. That's Regina Call, and Maria Leffingwell was one of the another sort of power couple there at the lodge with their husband Roy. They had a turkey farm, which actually figures into the story, believe it or not. So let me give you a flavor of more of the people involved. Now, I told you that our founding lodge master and my teacher, Phyllis Seckler, was on site there, and she was really good at capturing the mood of events and the personalities involved. So she was actually doing these sketches of life at the lodge. And here's one of them. And she captioned it, thankfully, so we got a very humorous discussion of who these people are and what they're doing. So here we have our happy family in a lighter mood. They are all discussing food as there is not enough of it at the table. To introduce each from left to right, we start with Jane, who has that look because she has just been told to economize and everyone insists on eating everything up. Next we have Joe, the only one to laugh at his foul puns. Then comes Frederick, looking a little wistful. We leave it to you to guess at what. Then comes Helen, pouring tea and listening to the din outside caused by the kids screaming, the cats meowing, the bark of the dogs, and the mewing of the kittens. Then comes Wilfred, smiling benignly on everyone's furbelows and foibles, and smoking instead of eating. On the other side is Regina, demanding more food. And next to her, Grace, very quiet because she helped cook it. Jonas is eating as usual, and next to him, Phyllis laughs at anything anyone says. Jack is asking for more and more jam at the foot of the table, and Betty is very sweetly handing it to him. Honored guests in the room are the flies and ants, and it is this person's personal opinion that they got most of the food. So, little slice of life. It was sketches like this that ended up in Crowley's hands that prompted Crowley to say in a letter to Phyllis in 1943, I say it quite seriously, I've had more illuminating information from the cartoons in particular than I have from all the rest that has come from California in the last quarter of a century. So he was quite interested in getting her take on it. Now, despite some initial suspicion, Jack grows to look on Smith and the members of the lodge with great fondness. In a letter to Smith, he says, you know, I was an only and lonely child, and it is a fine thing to inherit such a large and splendid family. I never knew a father, and it is nice to have one now. So, bonding, right? Jack says to Helen one day, rocketry may not be my true will, but it's one hell of a powerful drive. With Thelema as my goal and the stars, my destination and my home, I have my eyes set on high. And his eyes weren't too set on high because they were also set on Helen's younger sister, Betty. And they begin an affair, while Helen is away on a family vacation. Not a class move, probably, but in any case, they were all very tolerant of each other's little adventures. So, Betty and Jack start an affair. Soon after that, Helen, Jack's wife, starts to have an affair with Smith, Grand Magus guy. Meanwhile, Helen, who is now sleeping with Smith, has replaced Regina Call as the priestess, and Jack has replaced her as the primary organizer of events, so Regina is pretty pissed, and pretty soon leaves. Lots of drama. But everyone, in spite of all these affairs and everything, one of the principles of Thelema is individual liberty. And so there was no judgment on the fact of multiple sexual partners. I think the value that would have been held up as important is good communication and honesty and openness about it. And who knows how that went in terms of everyone communicating well. I point this out with regard to sexuality because one of the things the show seems to put a lot of emphasis on, probably because it's titillating and makes people watch, is these sex parties that are happening at the house, and they make it seem like OTO activity itself is based on people having sex all the time, which is not the case. But it does accurately show that there was a culture of sexual freedom in the house. And all kinds of personal freedoms, including sexual freedoms, are pretty important values in Thelema. So that extends to someone who might find that their personal choice, that their personal path in life was to be completely monogamous. That's great too. The point is freedom, not imposed anything. So the show's getting some of it right, but kind of spinning it in a way that makes it seem like it's all about sex or something. So about this time, back to rocketry, Parsons lands on the idea, thinking of the legendary Greek fire, which was an explosive that no one had ever quite figured out how the Greeks did it. He thinks of the idea of adding asphalt to the explosive mixture, and this becomes the key that opens up the whole field of solid fuel rocketry. The descendants of Parsons' original fuel in that discovery were used to fire Polaris, Poseidon, Minuteman ballistic missiles. They've been used in all the rockets that have sent people to the moon. They've been used in the rockets that were used on the space shuttle. So Jack's original aspirations to kind of head to the stars weren't met in his lifetime, but his work was absolutely seminal in getting that to be possible. At Jack's instigation, the lodge moves from Hollywood to 1003 Orange Grove in Pasadena, which is the former home of a lumber millionaire and Caltech benefactor named Arthur Fleming. And so Jack and Betty, remember this is Helen's younger sister, who is now Jack's partner, they have their room. And then Wilfred, Turpin Grandmagus, and Jack's wife, who is still his wife, Helen, have another room. Phyllis and her two kids lived on the top floor. And she was doing a lot of the cleaning and cooking for the house. Jane Wolfe was in charge of buying things, going out and getting groceries and stuff. Jack donates most of his salary to support the lodge, more than anyone else for sure. He was definitely the financial engine. So the parties continue in Pasadena. The FBI gets curious, starts to investigate. OTO's treasurer at the time, Carl Römer, that's him and his wife Sasha, gets a little annoyed by all the expenditures happening for these parties because he wants the money to go to Crowley so that Crowley can be supported to live, but also to publish books. So there's this tension between Germer and all the freewheeling expenditures going on in LA. They blame Smith for it, and this is the start of everyone kind of deciding that Smith is a bad influence. So basically Smith gets exiled. The lodge is kind of split in terms of loyalties to Smith versus everyone else. And so by 1943, only 5 of the original inhabitants are still there. It's Parsons, Betty, Smith, Helen, and Jane Wolfe. Smith gets exiled. Parsons takes over as lodge master. So spoiler event for season 2, maybe. He starts to repopulate the lodge with new residents. Several members have babies, including Smith and Helen. They have a child. Smith is exiled, as I said. Jack resigns because he's mad about Smith getting exiled, but then Crowley talks him into coming back. Parsons continues to work at what is now known as Aerojet. Anybody heard of it? And he and Foreman and others are traveling frequently all around the country as ambassadors of rocketry, trying to get companies to buy their stuff or the military to get interested. You see some of that on the show. And Aerojet is moving into full-scale implementation of all these ideas that Jack had been just experimenting with out of the desert, blowing things up, but now it's actually getting used in products, so you probably like that. In 1944, Parsons and Foreman sold their Aerojet stock when General Tire, the company General Tire, bought Aerojet. And they each made about $12,000 for their stock. For context, if they'd held on to it 20 more years, it would have been worth $12 million. So that's called selling low when you should have sold high, I think. But he didn't live that long anyway. He occasionally worked, he quit Aerojet, occasionally worked as a consultant there, but basically they lost the need for his brand of experimentation and research. It was just, they'd moved past that. And he's kind of out of a job. Smith eventually comes back from exile, broke, and Helen is making all their money by working all the time. Parsons still likes Smith, even though he's a bit suspicious, and he allows Smith and Helen to move back into the house in the carriage house there in Pasadena. So Crowley is getting frustrated with Jack still liking Smith. Are you confused yet? Crowley is getting frustrated with Jack's allegiance to Smith, so he writes to Jane Wolfe and says, Jack is a bit like a marshmallow sundae. He does what the last person to talk to him tells him. I've never had a marshmallow sundae do what I told it to, but I guess I get the metaphor. He's a little mushy. He is, moreover, too ready to emphasize the sexual side of life. Science, art, philosophy, and the like are our prime care. We must intensify, concentrate, exalt this side of our nature. Do get Jack to see this. He has so much A1 in him. So, I haven't seen too many other quotes where Crowley says, let's not emphasize the sex so much. But there's one, at least. So you know that Jack must have really been taking it, to the limit to get Crowley to push back on him for sex. So Jack finally divorces Helen, and Helen marries Smith. That's why she is now known as Helen Parsons Smith. Okay? Around this time, a fantasy sci-fi writer who Jack had met through his LA sci-fi connections starts to show up at the lodge. Any guesses? L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology. Later of Scientology. Parsons and, in fact, everybody in the house really liked him at first. He was fun, he had all these adventure stories, which turned out to be mostly bullshit, but it was fun stories. So everyone likes him, and things are going great until Hubbard starts to have an affair with Betty, who's been with Jack. Now, Jack, who has previously been very proud of his nonchalance about his lover's dalliances, but this one makes him jealous. This one really bothers him, and he for a while, is pretty upset at Hubbard. So, having lost Betty for the most part, and lost his work, he's intensifying his focus on magic. According to Crowley and Wolfe, maybe his thinking on this isn't that clear. Maybe he's getting off track a little bit. So Crowley writes to Parsons and says, I don't like at all what you say about witchcraft. All this black magic stuff is 75% nonsense, and the rest plain dirt. There's not even any point to it. It's important to note that Crowley never considered himself a black magician. That was the popular, essentially the tabloid press of the day, to deride him and demean his work as some sort of sinister black magic stuff. That wasn't what he was about at all, truly. He really saw magic as a path to self-development, spiritual development, and in a way that is entirely life-supporting and positive when you understand its core. And as you may be able to tell from my passion on this point, if there's one thing you come away from tonight with, if you're unfamiliar with Crowley, Thelema, and the OTO, let it be that you can't believe everything you read online, and that what we are trying to do in this tradition is truly to help each person thrive as who they are. And that was definitely Crowley's mission. Black magic for him was a distraction. It was a diversion from the main point of it all. Parsons writes back to Crowley, I know that witchcraft is mostly nonsense, but I'm so nauseated by Christian and theosophical guff about the good and the true that I prefer the appearance of evil to that of good. I think he just likes the vibe, doing something kind of transgressive and evil, evil in quotes, But Crowley, as we just heard, saw it a different way. So Parsons and Foreman, his buddy, start to work together to evoke spirits to visible appearance, which apparently, on at least one occasion, really scared the crap out of Foreman, seeing entities floating outside his window, and screams, hearing screams. Jane Wolfe got worried about this and wrote to Germer, there's something strange going on. From the start, Jack always wanted to evoke something, no matter what, I'm inclined to think, so long as he got a result. The other residents got a little paranoid. At one point, there was someone who felt certain there were troublesome spirits in the wood paneling. So, it is possible, believe me, for people to get too driven by fear in this work and superstition, and to freak out and overcompensate and live from that fear place. And I think we had a whole household of sort of getting into a little bit of mass hysteria there. That, oh no, we messed it up and now we can't fix it, and there's spirits, demons everywhere. I wouldn't worry so much. But I'm a therapist, it's my nature not to try to get people not to worry. So in December in 1945, Jack begins working to conjure an elemental mate as a replacement for Betty. Betty's gone with Hubbard, right? They're still in the house, but she's not his anymore. So he uses what's known as Enochian techniques, Enochian magic techniques from a tradition from the Renaissance era, and some sexual magic techniques. And sure enough, January 18th, 1946, Marjorie Cameron shows up on the doorstep there in Pasadena. Oh, sorry, missed Hubbard. There's young Hubbard. Forgot super easy. Here is Marjorie Cameron and Jack. Cameron was an artist and is now a very well-known artist many years after her death. But at the time, she was a budding artist and found Jack somehow, and they start a relationship, which has a very different character apparently to Jack's relationships with Helen and Betty, whereas Helen was kind of the supportive, keep the house running traditional wife, at least at first for him, and Betty was much more of a good sexual partner for him, and they had more of a sparkly kind of interaction. Cameron and Jack were both really independent people, strong-willed, maybe even bullheaded, and people around them at the time said that they weren't necessarily, they wouldn't come across as a real affectionate couple or like a couple at all sometimes. But they had some sort of connection. Jack felt that she was the result of his magic, that her showing up was the result he was looking for. They begin to do what he later came to call the Babylon working. Babylon is an important concept in Thelema, seen as a goddess. There's the seer, the person doing the sort of visionary work of this book, of this Babylon working, was L. Ron Hubbard. So whether he was making it up as he went along or not, Hubbard was there getting these results and feeding them back to Parsons. Parsons felt that Hubbard was unusually psychically sensitive, that he was able to, that he was especially good at kind of sensing what was happening in the astral worlds, putting it into words. So that's why he got Hubbard to help him. So this is the Strange Angel painting from Cameron that's referenced in the book title and the show title. Just so you know. I don't think that's photorealistic. It's sort of impressionistic. So, about this time, Jack actually sells the house that the lodge has been in. Roy Leffingwell takes over as lodge master. Jack forms a business partnership with Betty and Hubbard. Hubbard has an idea, and we can trust Hubbard. Hubbard decides that we're going to go to Florida and buy 3 yachts. We're going to sail them back to California and sell them at a profit. So all I need from you, Jack, is most of your money, and I'm going to take Betty, the one who used to be your partner, and we're going to go to Florida and buy these boats. We'll be back. But instead, what he does is he goes to Florida with Betty, and they buy 3 yachts with almost just Jack's money, and stay there partying on the yacht. Jack figures this out after weeks and weeks, and goes to Florida, goes to the marinas, trying to figure out where they were. And turns out they had actually already sailed away, planning to leave the country on this boat. So Jack goes to his hotel room and does this Mars ritual, invoking the spirit of Mars to stop them. And, you know, maybe it's coincidence, maybe who knows. There's a terrible storm that shreds the sails on their boat, and Hubbard and Betty motor back into the marina, and Jack is there waiting for them. And what they arrange is for Hubbard to pay a promissory note to Jack in exchange for not pressing further charges, and they somehow work it out, I guess. But I don't think Jack ever saw any profits from these boats, or, you know, probably never saw the boats again. And the rest is kind of history when it comes to Hubbard. This is the person, Betty, who was known as Sarah at that time, who became Hubbard's wife, and they had at least one child. She has horror stories to tell later on in her life about life with Hubbard. And if you haven't watched that documentary called Going Clear on Scientology, it's the way they talk about Thelema and Crowley is silly. Ignore that part, but the rest of it is pretty interesting about learning about Hubbard. And you can see, there's Hubbard and Betty later, you can see in Scientology how Hubbard had gotten ideas from the way the OTO was structured. There's, you know, in Scientology, there's all these levels where you have to, by paying a lot of money, level up to the next thing, and OTO has that in terms of initiatory degrees. It's not nearly like financially based like Scientology is. Pretty minimal that way. The way we do it, it's all about, you know, trying to learn along the way and better yourself, and not pay tens of thousands of dollars just to get the next degree. But you can see where Hubbard was inspired by some of these concepts, and the idea that you have this sort of stepwise pathway to self-mastery and stuff like that. So Scientology obviously was way more financially successful than Thelema ever has been, but I don't think for the right reasons. I should say, I know people who have been involved in Scientology who feel they have personally benefited from the theory and practice, and so I don't want to take anything away from someone who's actually benefited from it. It is clear that the organization has been pretty corrupt. So Parsons gets a job eventually with North American Aviation, marries Cameron in 1946, 4 days after he's divorced from Helen. And then he gets fired because those old FBI investigations resurface, and he's accused of being a communist. This is getting into the zone of the Red Scare days where everyone's afraid of communism. And a month later, after he loses his job, Cameron, who's also known as Candy, leaves him, goes to Mexico to work on her art. Crowley dies. Crowley, around 1947, last year of his life. Crowley dies in 1947, leaving Carl Germer in charge of OTO. Last word of the equinox from Crowley. This was Carl Germer telling Jane Wolfe and everyone in the U.S. that Crowley had died. This is the telegram. Parsons then continues his magical work. He's trying to do what is known in our tradition as crossing the abyss, which is basically transcending the limitations of individual human consciousness to open up to more cosmic consciousness. Usually it is a term used incorrectly by people who want to suddenly claim to have a lot of illumination and lord it over you somehow. So be on the lookout for anyone who approaches you telling you they've crossed the abyss. But around this time also, he's doing some important writing, and the things that he leaves behind from this era are some of his most important works, like an essay called Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. If you get a hold of that one, that's a good one to read in terms of getting Parsons' basic thought. he was pretty pissed at the U.S. government about how they were treating him and his work and the lack of tolerance for diverse thoughts and philosophies and behaviors. So it's kind of a screed against the U.S. government at the time. He draws some interesting conclusions about the remedies for this, however, saying that the incarnation of the goddess Babylon is the solution for all of this. And so he declares himself as the Antichrist and goes to seek out Smith to help him. From what I have just said, it may not be hard to come to the conclusion that this was a rather dark time in Parsons' life. He was a little bit confused and off track. But he gets it back together eventually. He regains his security clearance, which he'd lost because of the FBI investigations, and he gets hired by Hughes Aviation, which is Howard Hughes, the famous reclusive, weird millionaire Howard Hughes. That's his company. Jack and Candy periodically reunite and then explode again and break up and reunite. But eventually she comes back, they move into the carriage house and a new house in Pasadena, which is actually on the same block as the old house that was demolished eventually, the one that he had to sell that was where the lodge had been. They move in there together, and this big house, which is the former estate of one of the most prominent attorneys in California at the time. He keeps his chemical experiments going, and importantly, he stores the chemicals there in the ground floor of his carriage house. If that sounded like foreshadowing and somewhat ominous, it was, because on June 17th, 1952, he's mixing some chemicals in a coffee tin, drops it, it ignites, and the entire place explodes. There was apparently actually a crater in the ground. It was such a big explosion. Stuff's blown everywhere. He's torn up. Actually doesn't die right away. They find him, call for a nurse and ambulance and everything. He dies. I forget if he dies on the way to the hospital or soon after arriving there. But the really sad part is that, in addition to him blowing up, which is sad enough, his mother was living inside as well, and she finds out that he's just died, and she kills herself with an OD on pain pills on the same day. So at that time, Jane Wolfe writes to Carl Germer, Jack was killed Tuesday, yesterday while experimenting with chemicals. Later in the day, toward evening, his mother committed suicide. I'll keep you informed if there's any further news. At present, I feel like I want to go to the funeral with at least one. So this was a big deal. Parsons and Candy were about to leave the next day for a vacation in Mexico. There wasn't a funeral, but he was cremated and his ashes were scattered out in the desert at a site that was one of his favorite places. It was apparently this intersection of power lines, and he liked the vibe there of the crackling electricity for some reason. So, it was near where they did some of their rocket testing. So they scatter his ashes there, and they had a memorial Gnostic Mass at Agape Lodge. On the right, we have the creed of the Gnostic Mass. You'll see some key terms there, like Babylon, Baphomet. But on the left, it says, we as Thelemites have not gathered together tonight to grieve over the death of a brother. We might personally wish he had not been in such a hurry to leave us. Brother John Whiteside Parsons has taken his last journey with the sun. We celebrate this Mass in his honor and speed him on his way in furtherance of his true will. So this was just a couple days after his death. We have this original Missal here tonight, and some other artifacts, which friend Andy here is going to start passing around if you want to have a look at them. One of them is that Missal. Another is a document called the Message of the Master Therian, which you'll see on the cover is given as published by the Church of Thelema in Pasadena, I think, or is it Hollywood?
Please don't remove them from me.
Yes, please don't take the nyloplastic. There's also the original, that sketch of Phyllis's that I showed you. You want to take a look at that? And I forget what the fourth thing is. But you remember? There's a fourth thing, which is awesome. Oh, it's the little pamphlet, Liber Oz, which was is one of the core texts of Thelemic ethics. And you'll see some of the publishing address on there. It's an original from this era. So after Jack's death, things got a little sensationalistic. LA lust cult. And they're talking about him blowing himself up and how weird it all was. And, as usual, turns out you can't trust tabloids to tell an accurate story.
Is that Confidential magazine?
Pardon?
Is that Confidential magazine?
You know, I don't know. Does it look familiar to you?
Yeah, I still like your typeface.
Oh, well, good eye. It took really decades for Parsons' contributions to rocketry to be recognized. Eventually, not only was he recognized at one of the anniversaries of some of the early testings in the late 60s, but they actually named a crater on the moon after him. It's called the Parsons crater. It's on the dark side of the moon, and there's a lot of craters on the moon named after a lot of people, but not just anyone gets a crater, right? It is a little ironic since apparently he actually made a crater when he blew himself up, but different crater. So let's talk about the aftermath of his death in terms of Thelema. So Crowley's dead, the lodge is mostly gone, kind of petering out. Pretty much Thelema was dead from the late 50s, right up until the late 60s, when, if you remember one of the early characters in our story, Grady McMurtry, who had visited Agape Lodge, had been exchanging letters with Phyllis Seckler, our founding lodge master. Grady was on the East Coast. Phyllis was here in Northern California. She said, Grady, I hear that Crowley gave you some emergency papers to restart the OTO. Why don't you come out and work with me? We'll restart the OTO. So out of the ashes in 1969, Phyllis and Grady and a couple other surviving people from the original Agape Lodge do the first initiations in OTO since probably the mid-50s. And this gives birth to the modern OTO. So this is, to give you some faces, putting them all together. We got Sasha and Carl Hermer on the sides. This is Jane Wolfe. Shortly before her death, she had gotten very ill, and there's Phyllis with her on the side. This is a latter-day photo of Phyllis and Grady. They were married, and had about as tempestuous a relationship as I have ever seen anybody have. They split up in the late 70s, and yet continued to collaborate within OTO as they needed to. This was actually in the mid-80s, long after their relationship split up. OTO gets rebooted in the late 60s, fueled in part by the counterculture movements, the youth movements of the 60s, the drug culture, free love, experimentation with Eastern religions and ideas, kind of a breaking down of traditional religion and all of that. And Phyllis Seckler continues on to 1979 when she founds 418 Lodge. So they're sitting by her mass altar in the basement of her home in Oroville, which is where I first encountered her. Much of this altar, this existing altar, including canvas fix and the altar surface and everything we're still using here at 42 Lodge. So a lot of heritage there too. And again, our 40th anniversary is next year, so hopefully maybe you'll come celebrate with us next year when we throw a party. At this point, I want to transition and take a breath, having gone through a lot of the chronological life history stuff with Parsons, and shift gears to talk a little bit about Thelema itself, to dispel any misunderstandings about who we are and what we do. And that can include things like, hey, what did they show on the TV show about the Mass, and what is it really like? Or what did they show about OTO initiations on the screen, and what is it really like? If you have any questions or thoughts about that, I'm here to help you get what I hope are correct answers for you. But before taking questions on anything, I want to talk about the basic concept of Thelema, which is, as the word Thelema says, is about the will. When Crowley's words, "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," are spoken, what that refers to is not a process, as it may sound, whereby someone can simply do whatever they feel like doing. In fact, it's the opposite. Do what thou wilt means discover your basic nature, your true will in life. Live it out with joy and beauty and passion. Leave plenty of space for other people to do the same. Don't step on their toes as they try to do their true will. And in living out your true will, your real reason for incarnating on this planet, for being here and being alive, in living that out, you may find that it very often isn't about just doing what you feel like doing. It's about what you're really here to do, what your core spiritual self is here to do. So contrary to all the tabloid coverage, which makes it sound like the whole point is do anything you want at any time, doesn't matter, kill people, who cares? It's nothing like that. It's all about trying to discover that true will, the real essence of yourself. Likewise, the Gnostic Mass is a celebration of some of the core principles that we feel help people do that. And if the Gnostic Mass is open to the public, you all, if you've never witnessed one, you're welcome to come. First and third Saturdays we do masses. There is a mass this Saturday at our spot at 25th and R down in Midtown. Come see it and see what you think. I will happen to be the priest myself that night, this Saturday, so for better or for worse, if you want to come see me do it. We have some materials on the table out there in terms of information about our upcoming events, stuff we can sell you, in terms of books and candles and little pins if you want to support our work that way. The OTO is a nonprofit. None of us make any personal profit off any of this. Nobody in the administration makes any personal profit on any of this. And therefore, your donations actually do support our ongoing work. A little bit more on Crowley himself. It is pronounced Crowley. Almost no one has heard it pronounced that way because people tend to say Crowley. And one of my greatest joys, I probably leapt off the couch when I realized that on this show they were going to say his name right. Because if I had to live through episode after episode of people saying Crowley, I would have thrown something at the TV, I'm sure. But they actually did their research pretty well. While they distorted some of the ways that the Gnostic Mass is presented and that sort of thing, they don't misquote the Book of the Law. They don't misquote the Gnostic Mass. They sometimes take these quotes out of context, but basically the principles they're describing in their interactions with people at the lodge are pretty close to what we do, in the sense of you can see the Grand Magus trying to help people find themselves. And you see that in Jack's interactions with the lodge, he's being inspired to find out who he is and to live his path and to pursue his career in rocketry as an extension of who he is as a spiritual being. This is embedded in the plot line pretty well, I think. So I was impressed by how they did that. I'd already said I liked the casting. I think they got the looks of people pretty well. You just can't take it too much at face value in terms of this is what a mass looks like. You certainly can't take it at face value that anything depicted as an initiation resembles in any way anything we do in OTO, because it isn't. But looks cool on TV. But Crowley himself was, in my estimation, a genius, writer, thinker, poet, crazy, outdoorsy mountaineer guy. He did a little bit of everything. He loved exploring the world's spiritual traditions. He went around, found as many teachers as he could, learned about Taoism, Judaism, Buddhism, yoga, Hindu traditions, and attempted to put a system together where he took the best parts of everything that works, like all the spiritual tools, the meditations or rituals that seem to work, and put them together in one system without expecting anyone to believe anything in particular. And this is one of his great contributions, and that is, here is a set of tools, you try it, you make up your mind about what it means. We're not going to make you believe in any fairy tales. We don't make you leave your brain at the door. Try it. If you don't like it, don't use it. Come to your own conclusions. And I think if every religious tradition had that kind of openness of mind around people deciding for themselves what things mean, we'd have a better world, no matter what system it is. Most of all, thank you for being here tonight. I hope it was entertaining and informative, and thanks for spending your evening with us.